She came to expose a monster, but found a man willing to bleed for her. In a city where every shadow hides a bullet and every heartbeat could be the last, will love survive the storm or be buried beneath it? The rain came down like shattered glass that night, rattling the window panes of the half-lit gallery as Alara Vance lingered among her own photographs, the walls still echoing with polite but indifferent applause that had greeted her failed exhibition, her heart heavier than the soaked canvas shoes squelching on the marble floor, as she stepped out into the street where the storm's icy fingers lashed at her face and her camera strap clung damply to her shoulder. She pressed the hood of her thin jacket tighter around her head, fighting the wind that smelled of wet concrete and distant river water, wondering how long one could keep chasing stories when nobody seemed to care about the truth she captured, yet refusing to let the bruised hope in her chest die as she reached for her phone and booked the cheapest option on the rideshare app, only to curse softly when the map showed another passenger would be sharing the ride, a small inconvenience compared to the endless drizzle, but still enough to sour her mood further. The car, a black sedan slick with water, pulled up with its headlights haloed in mist, and she slipped into the back seat, shivering as the heater exhaled a weak breath, the windows fogged by her damp clothes and the driver's muttered complaints about the flooded roads, when the door opened again with a gust of wind that scattered rain like needles across her lap, and a man slid in beside her, tall enough that his shoulders brushed the roof, the rich charcoal wool of his suit plastered dark and heavy to his frame, droplets tracing the sharp edge of his jaw as he nodded briefly at the driver and shut the door with a soft thud that somehow sounded like a command. Ilara shifted slightly toward the window, the scent of rain-drenched cologne mingling with the faint metallic tang of blood reaching her before she even saw it, just a small dark patch staining the cuff of his immaculate white shirt, a detail her photographer's eye seized on instantly, along with the restless flicker in his green eyes as they swept the street outside with the precision of a hawk, never resting, always searching, as though he expected danger to erupt from every corner. The car rolled forward through streets drowned in rainwater and flashing emergency lights, the wipers fighting to keep pace with the torrent while thunder grumbled overhead, and in the dim interior she felt the air thickening with something that was not quite threat but not quite safety either, her pulse skipping when his gaze met hers for a fraction of a breath before he looked away again, the line of his mouth tight with secrets, the silence between them loud enough to drown out the hum of the engine. A silence she broke only by shifting her camera on her lap, her fingers brushing the familiar cool metal that had been her anchor in lonely nights of chasing stories no one wanted to hear. She told herself she was imagining the weight in his posture, the coiled stillness in the way he sat, too calm, too alert, the kind of composure she had only ever seen in soldiers or people who had lived too close to violence. Yet she could not stop glancing at him out of the corner of her eye, her curiosity a small flame against the storm outside, and when lightning tore the sky open for a split second and carved his face in pale silver light, she saw the fine scar running just beneath his temple, and the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the fingers he clenched together as if to keep them steady. And before reason could catch up with instinct, she lifted her camera just enough to click a silent photo, a habit born of years of capturing fleeting human truths, unaware that the single image she had just taken would become the first domino in a chain that would change her life. The flash stayed off, the utter sound masked by the thunderclap, and he didn't seem to notice, still watching the rain-soaked world outside as if counting shadows. But she felt the spark of an unspoken connection flicker in, that small space between them, as though some part of him recognized the hollow ache in her chest, and some part of her sensed the locked-away grief behind his guarded eyes, and for a breathless moment, between the roar of the storm and the quiet hum of the car, they were simply two weary souls sharing the same fragile shelter in a world determined to drown them both. The car glided through the flooded streets for only a few more minutes before the night cracked open with the raw snarl of engines behind them, a jolt that made Alara's heart leap even before she saw the blur of headlights in the mirror. And then the world erupted, tires screeching, the driver's startled curse lost beneath the metallic cough of gunfire that ripped through the rain-soaked darkness, a deafening staccato that shattered the windows into glittering shards, the wind rushing in icy and violent as the Uber skidded sideways. Alara gasped as her camera bag tumbled to the floor and she flung her hands over her head on instinct. But before she could draw a breath, Kaelen moved with startling speed, one arm hooking across her shoulders and pulling her down, his body covering hers as more bullets punched through the car's frame with brutal, ringing thuds, his voice low but fierce as he ordered her to stay down, the heat of his breath against her ear even as glass rained over them and the driver jerked forward against his seatbelt with a sickening finality that made Alara's stomach twist. Kaelen winced as a fresh crack of gunfire tore through the passenger side, a crimson line opening on his sleeve, yet he stayed between her and the chaos, his shoulders rigid, his eyes hard as he risked a glance through the broken window, then barked at the driver, already still and slumped, that they had to move, realizing too late the man behind the wheel would never answer again. The attacker's car slammed into theirs from behind, jolting them both forward, and Kaelen seized Alara's wrist with a firm, unhesitating grip, yanking the door open and dragging her out into the teeth of the storm, their shoes splashing into knee-deep water that surged down the gutters as if the river itself had broken loose, the air thick with cordite and rain, and the wail of approaching sirens that sounded distant yet too close for comfort. She stumbled to keep up as he propelled them into a side street, his injured arm held close to his chest, his free hand keeping her moving as another burst of gunfire spat sparks against the brick wall beside them, forcing them to duck behind an overturned trash bin before sprinting again. The streets twisting into a maze of slick alleys littered with trash bags that glistened like oil-slicked shadows, their breaths ragged and loud in the pauses between the echo of shots. Alara's lungs burned as they reached the narrow mouth of a dead-end alley, Kaelen finally stopping beneath a sagging metal awning that rattled under the downpour, pressing his back to the wall as if to shield her, even now, his chest rising and falling rapidly, but his voice controlled when he asked if she was hurt, and when she shook her head, still clutching the camera that had somehow stayed slung across her, his gaze fell to it with something darker than mere suspicion, a flicker of recognition that she had been holding it the moment the first bullet tore through the car, and the question in his eyes was sharp enough to slice through her fear. She hesitated, remembering the photo she had taken of him earlier, the way her instincts had always driven her to document the truth, and she knew he had already guessed the answer before she could find her voice, his jaw tightening as he stepped closer, the rain streaming down his face and dripping from his lashes as he told her in a low, strained tone that keeping any image of what had just happened was not only reckless but lethal, that the men who had just tried to kill them would tear apart the city to silence a witness, that anyone holding evidence would not live to see another sunrise. There was no menace in his words, only a raw urgency that unsettled her even more than a threat would have, and in that moment, staring into the eyes of a man she had thought untouchable, she saw something she had not expected, a flicker of real fear, not for himself, but for her, for the way her existence had just been entangled with his in a game of blood and shadows she had never asked to play. And as the storm howled through the dark labyrinth around them and distant sirens wailed like grieving ghosts, Alara felt the sharp edge of her own breath catch in her chest, not just from terror, but from the realization that the ruthless stranger who had shielded her with his own body was not merely a monster carved by the underworld, but a man caught in a world that seemed determined to devour them both. The sirens faded into the distance, as Kaelen, still holding Alara's wrist with a grip that was firm, yet strangely careful, guided her through a labyrinth of narrow, waterlogged streets until the dim yellow glow of a 24-hour diner appeared like a beacon in the storm-drenched night, its flickering neon sign humming above a cracked window pane, where rain trailed in shimmering lines. And when he finally pushed the door open, the bell above it gave a tired jangle that sounded more like a sigh than a welcome. The diner smelled faintly of burnt coffee and damp leather, its vinyl booths patched and peeling, a lone ceiling fan stirring the heavy air while a sleepy cook flipped something on the griddle without looking up. and Kaelen steered her to a booth in the far corner beneath a flickering light that cast shadows across his rain-darkened suit and the smudge of dried blood on his sleeve, the sight of which made Alara's pulse quicken with a blend of dread and something far more complicated. She placed her camera on the table as if laying down a confession, then, with fingers that trembled only slightly, scrolled through the images. Shards of glass caught mid-fall, the spray of water lit by muzzle flash, the blur of men with guns. And lifting her chin as though bracing for judgment, she pressed the delete button in front of his watchful green eyes, her heart thudding with the lies she was keeping as the tiny memory card, hidden in the spare battery compartment beneath the camera's flap, held the real record of the night's violence. His gaze lingered on her face longer than on the camera's blank screen, as if searching for the truth beneath her calm. And when the silence stretched between them, heavy with things unspoken, he surprised her by leaning back in the booth and murmuring almost absently that there had been a time, long before his father's name became a curse and an inheritance, when he had dreamed of nothing more dangerous than a brush and a canvas, that his hands, now too familiar with the weight of a gun, had once itched to capture the light over the lake at dawn, the curve of a street after the rain, the small ordinary things that seemed to hold pieces of the world's lost innocence. Alara, who had spent her life trying to frame the unguarded truths of strangers, found herself momentarily robbed of words, for in the soft rasp of his voice and the way his eyes lost their wary edge as he spoke, she caught a glimpse of the man he might have been if the world had been kinder. And as the rain tapped insistently against the diner's windows, she felt the strange, quiet pull of recognition, of a loneliness that mirrored her own, of a yearning to be seen not as a weapon or a witness, but as a person who had once believed in beauty. The cook refilled their coffee with a gruff nod and shuffled away, and Kaelen curled his fingers around the mug but didn't drink, his attention still fixed on her as though the act of having someone listen without judgment was both foreign and dangerous to him, while she struggled to steady her breathing, caught between the memory of him throwing himself over her in the car, and the knowledge that the man before her was bound to a world steeped in blood and vengeance. Outside, the storm softened to a steady drizzle, and in that muted lull they sat across from each other, two strangers linked by the night's violence, and by a fragile thread of understanding that neither dared acknowledge aloud, until at last he glanced toward the pale horizon creeping into the sky beyond the window, and said in a voice that carried both command and quiet reassurance that it was time to get her home. The streets at dawn were empty and glistening like a city washed clean, though both of them knew it was an illusion, and as they walked the final block in silence, the drizzle clung to their hair, and the soles of their shoes splashed in shallow puddles, and when they reached the stoop of her apartment building, he stopped, keeping a respectful distance yet radiating an unspoken vigilance that made her chest tighten, promising in a low, steady tone that he would see to it that no harm came to her, a promise that felt as much a warning as a shield. And as she climbed the worn steps to her door, pausing once to glance back at the figure standing on the rain-damp sidewalk, she couldn't decide whether the sight of him watching her with that guarded, unreadable expression made her feel safer or more exposed, but she carried the warmth of his words with her into the dim hallway, as if it were a small, fragile light against the shadows gathering at the edges of her world. Dawn had barely broken when the muted glow of the rising sun slipped across the rain-slicked streets, painting the world in pale silver as Alara lingered by her apartment window, staring down at the city that felt less like home and more like a battlefield she had accidentally wandered into. The warmth of Kaelen's parting words still clung to her like an uninvited echo, and yet the reality of what she had seen, the dead driver, the shattered glass, the bullets splintering the night, pressed down on her chest until it was hard to breathe, harder still to convince herself that the danger had passed. When her phone buzzed with a news alert, she didn't expect the headline to slice through her composure like a blade. Rideshare driver executed in mob massacre. Authorities seek witness. Her hand trembled so badly she nearly dropped the phone, her mind scrambling to reconcile the man who had shielded her with his own body with the one the city called its most ruthless crime lord. Across town, as the story exploded on social media and news anchors spoke in solemn tones about escalating gang violence, Jenna barged into Alara's apartment, her eyes wide, her voice sharp with disbelief, as she shoved her own phone toward her friend, demanding to know if it was true that the mysterious passenger who had saved Alara in that hellish rainstorm was none other than Kaelen Thorne, the name that made even hardened cops lower their voices. Alara tried to speak, but the words snagged in her throat like barbed wire. She wanted to tell Jenna everything, that Kaelen had risked his life for her, that he wasn't the monster the headlines painted. But guilt slammed into her like a wave, because some part of her still feared him, feared what it meant that he had shown up in her life at all. The weight of what she was hiding from her best friend pressed between them, an invisible wall of secrets as Jenna's anger mixed with fear, her voice breaking as she warned Alara that being near a man like that was a death sentence. Alone again after Jenna stormed out, Alara sank onto the edge of her couch, clutching her camera to her chest as though it were both her lifeline and her curse, the memory of Kaelin's arm, wounded yet unflinching as he shielded her, haunting her like a fragile, dangerous truth. That night, as rain returned to the city in thin silver threads against the windows, there came a sharp knock at her door that froze her in place. Her heart stumbled painfully before she forced herself to move, peering through the peephole to see Silas, Kaelin's right hand, standing in the dim hallway like a shadow carved from stone. At first, the sight of him filled her with a rush of dread so vivid she almost didn't open the door, but something in the way his eyes swept the hall, in the quiet steadiness of his voice as he asked if she was safe, made her realize that this wasn't a threat but a promise being kept, that Kaelen had sent someone to watch over her. Still, the air between them remained taut, strung with unspoken warnings. As Silas's gaze lingered on the camera lying on her coffee table, he didn't ask questions, but the brief flicker of something wary in his eyes told her he knew, or at least suspected, that she had captured more than she should have. When he left, disappearing as silently as he'd arrived, she stood in the doorway long after the echo of his footsteps faded, feeling the strange duality of Kaelin's presence in her life, protector and predator all at once. By morning, the city buzzed with rumors. Police scanners crackled with talk of rival gangs scouring neighborhoods for an unnamed witness, described only as a girl with a camera, and Alara felt the world closing in on her like a tightening noose. She couldn't walk to work without feeling unseen eyes tracing her steps, couldn't lift her camera to capture the dripping rain on a fire escape without imagining a bullet finding her first. Yet despite the gnawing fear, she couldn't bring herself to erase the backup card hidden in her dresser drawer, the one piece of proof that the ambush had been more than just another act of senseless gang violence. That night, when thunder growled across the horizon and lightning momentarily lit the skyline, she found herself replaying Kaelin's brief, almost accidental softness, the haunted glint in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking, the way he had shielded her wit. Out hesitation, wondering how a man who could command so much fear could also carry such unspoken grief. Somewhere in the city's underbelly, Kaelen was no doubt waging his private war, but in her small, dimly lit apartment, it was Alara who felt the full weight of being a witness, trapped between loyalty to the truth and the quiet, inexplicable trust she had begun to place in the very man the world warned her to fear. The rain had slowed to a silver drizzle by the time Alara, still shaken by the revelation that rival gangs were hunting for the unknown witness, found herself standing on the curb outside her building, hugging her damp jacket around her as the city's restless hum crept back into the streets. Then a black SUV rolled to a smooth, almost predatory stop at the corner, the tinted window humming down to reveal Silas's familiar profile, calm but unyielding, as he informed her in a voice that carried no room for argument that Kaelen wanted her to come with them, that it was no longer safe for her to stay alone. And before she could summon the words to resist, she remembered the way gunfire had shredded the storm-soaked night and the cold look in the eyes of the men who had hunted them, and so she nodded, stepping into the car that smelled faintly of rain and leather, and something darker she couldn't name. The drive through the glittering post-storm city felt strangely suspended in time, streetlights streaking across the windows like faint comets, Her fingers curled in her lap as she tried not to let the weight of her heartbeat betray how unsteady she felt. And when the SUV finally glided to a stop before a high-rise tower that seemed to rise like a shadowed blade against the bruised clouds, she caught herself wondering not for the first time how she had ended up in the orbit of a man whose name the city spoke only in murmurs. The elevator's ascent was silent except for the distant hum of the cables and the soft thud of her pulse in her ears. And when the doors opened onto a penthouse of polished concrete and muted steel, she was surprised by the understated elegance of it. Walls adorned not with trophies of violence, but with carefully framed black and white photographs of rain-slick streets and distant skylines, a stark contrast to the man's reputation. And as Kaelen appeared from the shadows of a glass-walled study, jacket gone, sleeves rolled, the faint graze on his arm bandaged but visible beneath the rolled cuff, she felt the prickle of the same wary pull she had felt in the back seat of that ill-fated Uber, as though the room itself shifted around his presence. His tone was level, even courteous, when he told her she would be safer here until the gangs had been forced back into their corners. But there was a roughness beneath the words that hinted at the weight of the war he was waging beyond these walls, and she replied with a guarded sort of sarcasm, unwilling to let herself slip too easily into the sense of safety that the height and silence of the penthouse seemed to promise. Later, as he moved to fetch her a clean towel from a hallway closet, she noticed a partially open drawer in the sideboard by the far wall and glimpsed, tucked amid neat stacks of files and ledgers, a battered sketchbook with the corner of a charcoal-smudged page curling out as if trying to breathe. When he returned and caught her glance, his expression flickered, the briefest crack in his carefully worn mask, and she said nothing, only turned away as if respecting a secret she hadn't meant to glimpse. But something in her chest tightened with the realization that there was more to this man than the headlines and whispered names suggested. It was later, when she sat at the edge of the wide window, gazing out at the city lights strung like a net across the river, that she felt the sting on her cheek where flying glass had caught her during the ambush, and Kaelen, returning with a small first aid kit, surprised her by kneeling beside her instead of merely handing it over, his hands steady but careful as he dabbed at the small cut with antiseptic, his green eyes momentarily softening, as though the act of tending to her wound disarmed him in ways a gunfight never could. And for a long, unguarded moment their gazes held, two people on opposite sides of the same war-torn night, silently acknowledging a connection neither had asked for, neither trusted, but could not entirely deny. She broke the moment first, thanking him in a low voice that came out rougher than she intended, and he shifted back to his feet with a brief, unreadable look, as if the space between them had grown unexpectedly fragile. Much later, long after the rain-streaked windows had gone dark with night again, Alara found herself unable to sleep in the guest room he had shown her, the murmur of voices carrying faintly from the study, drawing her down the silent hallway on bare feet, until she stood just outside the cracked door and heard Kaelen's voice, sharp with restrained fury, speaking into the phone. Something about Ronan, about surgeons fighting to keep him alive after the ambush, about retaliation that could not wait much longer. And for the first time, she heard a strain in his voice that was not merely anger, but grief. The sound of a man who had already lost too many pieces of his chosen family to a war he hadn't truly wanted to inherit. She backed away quietly before the call ended, heart beating too fast, retreating to her room and closing the door as softly as she could, sitting for a long time on the edge of the bed staring at her hands, realizing with a new and unsettling clarity that the man who had shielded her in the storm was still, at the core, the dangerous heir to a bloody empire, and that every step she took further into his world, whether driven by curiosity, guilt, or the reluctant spark of something that felt too much like empathy, that would make it harder to step back into her own. The night was restless in Alara's chest long after the city lights had dimmed beneath the weight of retreating clouds, and by dawn Kaelen's knock at her door was softer than she expected, carrying an odd hesitancy that made her heart stumble before she even rose. She followed him through the quiet penthouse corridors, still clutching the edge of her jacket, as if it were armor. And when they stepped into the elevator, she sensed a shift in the air around him, a quieter gravity that seemed to grow heavier as they descended to the private garage and slid into the back of a sleek black car, waiting like a silent animal at rest. The drive cut through narrow streets still glistening from the last remnants of the storm, puddles catching fragments of the awakening sky. And when they turned off the main road onto an unmarked lane, flanked by abandoned warehouses and graffiti-scarred brick walls, she felt the unmistakable thrum of danger beneath her ribs, yet Kaelen's profile beside her was unreadable, as though he were bracing himself for something more personal than an ambush. The car stopped in front of a nondescript iron-shuttered building with vines creeping stubbornly up the walls, its windows long boarded up, and as Silas swung the heavy doors open, the scent of turpentine and dust drifted out to greet them like the ghost of another life. Inside, the vast studio was dim and cavernous, shafts of early light cutting through fractured glass panes to reveal canvases draped in worn sheets, an old easel leaning like a sentinel in the far corner, and Alara, stepping carefully over a stray brush fallen long ago, sensed she was walking into a secret he had not intended to share with anyone else. Kaelen lingered by a paint-splattered table, as though the ghosts of his own hands haunted it, then quietly admitted, almost to himself, that he hadn't set foot here in years, that once he had dreamed of painting the city as it might have been, not the way he had been forced to rule it, and something in his voice, rough, stripped of the steel she had come to expect, made her chest tighten, as if the man standing there was not the feared name whispered in alleyways, but the boy who had once held a brush instead of a gun. She moved closer without quite meaning to, brushing the edge of a dusty canvas with her fingertips, and when their eyes met across the faded colors of his unfinished work, the world outside seemed to draw in its breath, the air charged with something fragile yet undeniable. He stepped nearer, slowly, as though afraid to startle her, his gaze flicking briefly to her mouth and then back to her eyes with a rare, unguarded softness that sent a rush of warmth spiraling up her throat, and for an instant it felt as if the ruined studio had folded in on them, shutting out every scar of the city beyond, until the sharp vibration of his phone shattered the spell. Silas's clipped voice came through like a blade drawn in the dark, warning that a hit squad had been sighted closing in on their location, and in the same heartbeat Kaelen's demeanor hardened, the softness wiped away by the lethal focus of a man who had spent too many years anticipating death at his door. He barked quick instructions into the phone, already scanning the exits with a soldier's precision, and Alara barely had time to retreat behind the heavy work table before the first concussive crack of gunfire erupted against the outer walls, the studio's echoing emptiness turning the sound into a thunderous snarl. She saw him draw his weapon with the smooth, deadly grace of instinct, Silas and two of Ronan's remaining men flanking the door while she crouched low, heart hammering as splinters burst from the doorframe under a hail of bullets, the acrid tang of gunpowder searing her throat. She caught glimpses of him between flashes of muzzle fire, Kaelen moving like a dark current through the chaos, firing with ruthless precision, yet always angling his body between her and the attackers, as if the very act of shielding her had become a reflex beyond thought. And the sight struck something deep and irrevocable inside her, burning away the lingering image of the monster she had believed him to be. A window shattered above her as one gunman tried to breach the side entrance, and she froze. But Kaelen was already there, knocking the intruder back with a shot that left her ears ringing, his face set in a grim mask that did nothing to hide the protective edge in his eyes when he glanced back to make sure she was unhurt. The firefight dragged on in a blur of smoke, shouts, and breaking glass, until finally the last of the hit squad retreated under the withering return fire of Silas's men, leaving behind the acrid silence that follows violence too close to the bone. Alara's knees trembled as she rose from her crouch, scanning the wrecked studio until she found him leaning against the wall near the broken easel, his shoulder slick with blood from a fresh wound just below the earlier graze, his breath coming hard yet controlled as he waved off Silas's urgent insistence to fall back. She crossed the distance between them without thinking, her fingers brushing his arm where the blood seeped through his shirt. And when his eyes met hers, the unspoken truth between them was as raw as the wound. This man was both the shield and the sword, both the darkness the world condemned and the fragile hope she had glimpsed in a quiet sketchbook. She wanted to tell him to stop throwing himself between her and death, but the words tangled in her throat as she watched him wince when Silas tightened a temporary bandage around his shoulder. And in that moment, she knew that the line she had tried to draw between herself and his world was blurring under the weight of each choice they made together. As the first distant wail of approaching sirens reached them through the settling dust, Silas urged them toward the rear exit where another car would be waiting, and Kaelen, refusing to let her out of his reach, wrapped his good arm around her as they slipped out into the maze of alleyways slick with rain, his steps slowing only once as a shudder passed through him from pain he could no longer mask. She gripped his hand tightly as they moved through the shadows toward safety, her heart thundering with the knowledge that the man bleeding beside her was no simple villain, but a fractured soul still fighting to protect the fragments of what he once wanted to be, and that somewhere between the pull of his past and the war closing in around them, her own heart had begun to fall in time with his unsteady but relentless heartbeat. The rain had eased into a ghostly mist that clung to the streets as Kaelen, pale but unflinching despite his wound, guided Alara through the service entrance of a discreet riverside safe house where Silas's men secured the perimeter, the low hum of engines and the faint metallic scent of blood still trailing them like a shadow. And while medics hurried Kaelen into a back room for stitches, Alara was left in the narrow kitchen staring out at the dark river, her hands trembling as if they carried the weight of the night's gunfire. It was there, as dawn thinned the mist and cast silver veins across the water, that Jenna's urgent messages lit up her phone, the screen flashing over and over until she finally answered in a hushed corner, her friend's voice sharp with both fear and disbelief, as she confessed she had discovered the backup memory card hidden inside Alara's camera bag, the one that held the photos of the ambush Alara had claimed to delete. And she warned her in a low, breaking tone that this was her last chance to bring the evidence forward, to expose Kaelen before his war swallowed her whole. But Alara, closing her eyes against the ache that spread through her chest, could only whisper that things were not as simple as the headlines made them seem, her voice tight as she promised to call back soon. When she turned, she found Kaelen standing in the doorway, his shirt loose around his freshly bandaged shoulder, eyes shadowed but steady, and she knew from the set of his jaw that he had heard enough to sense the distance between them widening like a crack in winter ice. Later, in the dim glow of a single lamp inside the safe house's sparsely furnished study, she faced him across a battered wooden desk, words spilling out in a rush that tasted of salt and guilt as she demanded to know how many more people had to bleed for his empire to stand, her voice trembling but unflinching as she forced herself to meet the unguarded grief that flashed in his expression before he masked it again. He did not deny the blood on his hands, instead leaning back against the edge of the desk, one hand braced against the wood as he admitted, with a hollow laugh that sounded too much like regret, that he had once planned to leave it all behind, to vanish into the world with nothing but his sketchbooks and a nameless cabin by the sea. But his father's death and Ronan's loyalty had dragged him back, binding him to the syndicate's legacy with chains he had never wanted to wear. The quiet in the room deepened, thick as the river fog outside. As Alara stepped closer, her voice softer now, but still edged with hurt, as she asked why he hadn't walked away anyway, why he hadn't let go before it consumed everything he might have been, and his answer, low, ragged, weighted with both fury and sorrow, was that vengeance had roots that strangled even the most desperate dreams, that too many graves had been filled for him to simply turn his back. The words struck her harder than she expected, stirring both pity and anger, and the emotions between them, held at bay for too long, finally surged to the surface in a clash of raised voices and sharp, unfinished sentences their tempers snapping like dry twigs until the space between them shrank to nothing, her hands trembling as she pressed her palms to his chest, as if to keep him at a distance, even as her eyes betrayed the longing she felt. Yet to deny, and then, in a moment, neither of them had planned nor fully understood. His lips found hers in a kiss rough with exhaustion and heartbreak, a fleeting, unguarded collision of two lives on opposite sides of the same storm. They parted just as quickly, both breathing hard, staring at each other as though the ground beneath them had shifted, and Kaelen's next words came out as a whisper, more like a plea than a promise, that he would have walked away for her if there had been any way left to do so. But before the air between them could settle, the study door burst open, and Silas stepped in with the grim urgency of a man who had seen too many close calls, his eyes fixed on Kaelen as he delivered the news that turned Alara's blood cold. The rival faction had discovered the identity of the witness who had survived the ambush, the girl with the camera, and their net was already closing in around her. The storm outside had not eased when Silas's urgent words still hung in the air, warning them that the rival gang now knew Ilara's identity, and before Kaelen or Ilara could exchange another glance, the roar of engines and the screech of tires shattered the fragile stillness, pulling them into the night and toward the old rain-lashed warehouse that would become their battlefield. Kaelen, despite the pain of his barely healed wound, moved with grim determination, his hand brushing Alara's arm in a fleeting, unspoken reassurance, as Silas and the remaining crew loaded their weapons and Ronan, pale but stubbornly upright, insisted on coming despite the bandages around his ribs. The ride to the warehouse tense and silent save for the rain pelting the roof and the low rumble of thunder that felt like the city itself was warning them of what was to come. When they arrived, the air inside the warehouse was damp and smelled of rust and oil, pools of water forming on the cracked concrete floor beneath the holes in the ceiling as shadows of their enemies flitted between the stacks of crates, and Kaelen's voice, low but steady, ordered his men to take positions while his sharp, blue eyes flicked to Ilara as if anchoring himself on her presence. Ilara clutched her camera like a lifeline, telling herself she needed to document everything for the truth she had always chased. But as she stepped in behind Kaelen, she realized the truth had never looked so human or so breakable. The first shots rang out like thunderclaps, shattering the eerie stillness, and she ducked behind a stack of pallets as Kaelen surged forward, gun in one hand, his other pressed briefly to his side where blood seeped through his shirt, but his movements were precise, lethal, yet somehow protective, always positioning himself between her and the gunfire. Through the crack between crates, she saw a man aiming straight for Kaelen's back, and without thinking, she raised her camera, the flash bursting like lightning in the dark, the assassin cursing and shielding his eyes just as Kaelen spun and fired, the man collapsing with a cry that was swallowed by the storm, and Ilara's heart thudded with a mix of terror and a strange pride that she had been more than a witness. Ronan, swaying but unyielding, took cover near the steel pillars, barking orders, his voice growing hoarse yet resolute, while Silas moved like a phantom through the chaos, each shot he fired precise, driving the rival gang backward inch by inch. Rain leaked in from the broken skylights, streaking down Kaelen's face and plastering his dark hair to his forehead as he fought with the raw intensity of a man who had nothing left to lose but one thing he refused to let go of, his gaze occasionally finding Ilara's as if to remind himself why he kept standing through the onslaught. When at last the gunfire dwindled and the last of the enemy fled into the night, leaving their dead behind, the warehouse was left echoing with the hollow drip of water and the ragged breathing of survivors, and for a moment, Ilara thought it was Avi. Until she saw Kaelen stumble, dropping to one knee, his gun clattering to the floor as the adrenaline bled away and the bullet lodged in his shoulder made itself cruelly known. She rushed to his side, heedless of the blood soaking into her hands as she pressed them over his wound, murmuring words she hadn't realized she knew, telling him to stay awake, to not dare leave her now, her voice breaking on his name. He looked up at her through the rain, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes unguarded and unbearably human, a quiet plea, a shadow of a smile that was almost tender, and he whispered that he had always feared this, that his world would drag her down into its shadows, and that perhaps she deserved a chance at a sunrise he could never give her. The paramedics Silas had called arrived too late to stop her from holding his face in her hands, from tracing the wet line of his cheek as if trying to memorize him before he could vanish. In the blur of flashing ambulance lights, Ronan was loaded onto a stretcher, still alive though pale, gripping Silas's arm and rasping that the fight was not yet over. But for tonight they had survived, while Kaelen refused the stretcher with a stubbornness that left Alara both infuriated and awed, allowing Silas to support him as they left the warehouse together. Outside, as dawn broke shyly through the retreating storm clouds, Kaelen turned to her, his expression unreadable except for the slight tremor at the corner of his mouth, and told her in a voice roughened by pain and something deeper that she was free now, that she should walk away before the darkness of his world reached for her again, that if she stayed, the next bullet might not miss. Alara stood still, the rain easing into a mist that clung to her lashes, torn between the raw truth in his words and the pull of the man who had stepped in front of death for her act, again and again. But in the end she nodded, silent tears slipping down her cheeks as she turned and walked toward the rising sun, her camera cradled in her hands like a fragile heartbeat, each step feeling both like a betrayal and an act of love. Behind her, Kaelen watched, rain-soaked and unflinching, as if burning her image into his memory, for the battles still ahead, while Silas and Ronan exchanged a look that held more grief than victory. And as the city woke beneath a bruised golden sky, Alara paused on a quiet street corner, lifting her camera to her chest as if it could hold the weight of her heart. And later, alone in her small apartment, she slid the hidden memory card from its slot, her breath catching as the first image appeared on the screen, not of gunfire or blood or the chaos she had sought to capture, but of Kaelen, standing in the pouring rain with his arms outstretched, his body curved over hers like a shield, his face turned away from the bullets and toward her, as if she were the only thing that mattered, a single frozen heartbeat that would haunt her long after the storm had passed, leaving her to wonder whether the man she had walked away from was truly a monster, or the last shadowed fragment of light in a world she had thought she understood.